Hello everybody, and welcome to this lovely event. We'll say a little bit more about how we're going to run it in a minute, but first of all I'll introduce myself. I'm Claire Langhammer. I'm Director of the Institute of Historical Research, and it is a real delight to have been asked to chair the second History and Archives in Practice event. History and Archives in Practice is a new initiative from the Institute of Historical Research, the Royal Historical Society, and the National Archives. It's designed to explore how historians and archivists collaborate by looking at the projects in which we are all currently engaged. Each event seeks to offer guidance and insight on good practice for future collaborations, and to showcase some of the many excellent collaborative projects that are currently taking place. Projects that really bring archivists and historians into close collaborative contact. Our first day conference was held at the IHR back in March, and I know many of you attended this. It was a genuinely lovely occasion that demonstrated just how rich and exciting our conversations can be when we think about practice together. We received a very large number of submissions to speak in March, and it wasn't possible to fit everyone into a single day. The people and projects we'll learn about today are ones that we wanted to hear from, but were unable to include last month. So this event is very much a continuation of the March conference, an opportunity to learn about additional projects and to continue the discussion we started in March. To think about how historians and archivists work together, what each of us needs in these collaborations, and how we might learn from one another to better undertake our historical practice. It's also an opportunity to experience the real joy that comes from thinking together about our archives. Today we're showcasing 5 projects: archives and paper trails, Kent Maps Online, co-creating heritage, challenging perceptions of Sierra Leone, slavery, law and power, and a story of the Great War, Will Bradshaw's journal. Now we're going to assume that everyone is familiar with these projects, having had the opportunity to watch videos about them in advance of this event. And personally, I found watching these completely absorbing, and I'm really looking forward to thinking with the individual projects and across the projects today. Our format is going to be as follows. I'm going to ask each of our panelists, who I'll be introducing, to speak for a couple of minutes on their project. I'll then pose a few questions based on themes that have emerged from our March conference, but that we'd like to think about how these specific projects today relate to those themes. After that, we'll have lots of time for your questions, so please do add to the Q&A function as we go. Okay, I'm going to introduce each panelist. As you know, hopefully you have all had the opportunity to meet them via their videos, which is kind of rather nice, but we'll now see them via the power of Zoom. So we're going to start with our 2-minute kind of overviews. So I would like to invite Sarah Aitchison, Head of Special Collections at UCL London, and Andrew Smith, Director of Liberal Arts at Queen Mary, University of London. So over to you two. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Claire. It's lovely to see so many people here. And we're going to try and keep this to 2 minutes each. Andrew and I are not excellent at this, so, you know, we'll see how we go. But because we're so overexcited by paper trails. So basically how this started, and I hope you've seen the film, is that Andrew, with his usual enthusiasm, came to Special Collections and asked to run a series of conferences, which would be linking academic papers with work with our community and school groups. And we did some of those, and they were so excellent and so interesting. And we got so many different audiences together that we just thought it was such a shame that the outputs of that and the reflections on that had nowhere to go, really. I mean, there were a few journals we could have put bits and pieces into, but we just really started to think about how we could create something combined that sort of reflected the work we were doing together. So this was at about the same point that UCL introduced what's known as a book. We can say it in any accent we choose, which is kind of a living book. So UCL is the first fully open access press in HE, which was founded in 2015, and it publishes about 50 open access books a year and about 14 academic journals. But they'd introduced this other kind of shape of thing, and we looked at this and went, this is amazing, we could really use this, because it had so many different levels. So it's kind of a living book, it's entirely open access, you can add to them over time, and we started talking to them about how we might do it, and we worked out that we could do lots of these different audience levels within this one publication, which seemed fantastic to us. So we put together a publication which contains several different streams. So that's, we've got research stories, which is more academic and works in thing, co-production, collection profiles, and engagement, so that we could have different levels of practitioner all the way through. I'm going to let Andrew talk now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, that's exactly it. I started working with UCL Special Collections when I was a teaching fellow, just doing kind of temporary contracted work, doing a lot of teaching, and I found some great opportunities for working with archives and special collections. And one of the things that really did for me is accentuated the role of the amazing people behind those collections as well. And I became increasingly frustrated when you read about, amazing discoveries and dusty archives and all these things. But actually what it includes is often ideas of, careful cataloguing work, really strong preservation, and, the idea of access should not just be assumed or ignored. And one of the things I wanted to do with some of this material is actually put that to the front as well, but also create spaces where, academic researchers and historians could be put in conversation with people who are information professionals working in archives, special collections, libraries, right across the board. And that's really what we've been trying to do. The latest update we have, currently in production, it should be out in the next week or so, looks at, takes its inspiration from the Hidden Voices exhibition and project at UCL Special Collections, unearthing kind of submerged voices in the catalogue. And actually, we've just launched a call for papers for another special update, which we'll be looking at in partnership with the University of Stirling Archives and their wonderful project on archiving the history of COVID-19 and responses to it. We'll be looking at creative responses to the history of COVID-19 to look at how it impacted collecting and cataloguing and archiving processes, but also how it impacted research stories as well. So the idea behind Paper Trails has always been collaboration, finding new avenues and opportunities for really starting new types of interesting stuff that we all get interested in. So as much as anything, it's meant to be a kind of platform for people to get involved with. So what I'd always say is, please do check it out. It's all there online. It's all free. It's all open, and we're always delighted to hear from people and for people to get involved as well. So please do take a look. And please do get involved. I think that takes us past our 2 minutes. So apologies.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Andrew. I think that very clearly demonstrates the joy that I was referencing, as well as making some really beautiful points about the surfacing of labour, the labour of historical work that we all do, and issues around form and audience. So thank you so much for that. So that's Archives and Paper Trails. We're now going to move on to Kent Maps Online. So I'd like to introduce Michelle Crowther, who is Learning and Research Librarian and co-lead on Kent Maps Online from Canterbury Christ Church University. Michelle.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. So Kent Maps Online is a digital humanities project. It's a collaboration between the School of Humanities and Education Studies at Canterbury Christ Church and also JSTOR Labs, who have generously supported us with IT support in the project. The site provides a set of themed essays about Kent. We're very proud of our county, and I'm sure you're all very proud of your counties. And originally started where we were looking at the idea of writers and their times, as the inspiration for the project is a professor of Victorian literature, Carolyn Oulton, and I'm one of her PhD students, so I'm also studying Victorian literature. And so we like the idea of these writers and how they inhabited Kent and how they connected with other people. And we felt that Kent has sometimes historically been London by the sea, but it's also been that place where everybody funnels through to go to the continent. So we felt we had a sort of really rich stories to tell. And so the project's been researching historic, literary and geographical records. We embrace all disciplines. We have geographers who have supported us. We have artists. We're not just Christchurch as well. We have some amazing academics in other institutions who have generously given us research articles. We present the essays using interactive visualizations, got IIIF images, videos, map overlays, and we're now looking at embedding 3D images, as one of our lovely applied humanities students has just digitized some of the objects in our collection. So we use freeware software, we use GitHub and Juncture, work with all sorts of local historians, societies and organisations. We're just looking to really tell a rich story of the history of Kent. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle, and really kind of showing us the importance of the visual and all the different ways in which we can work with the visual, as well as the importance of interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity to the work that we do. Thank you ever so much. So from Kent Maps Online to co-creating heritage, challenging perceptions of Sierra Leone. I'm introducing here Nick Evans, Senior Lecturer in Diaspora History from the University of Hull. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. As you'll have hopefully seen from the video, we had an exciting collection of photographs, but one of the challenges, I guess, for historians and archivists working together is how to amplify voices from the archive which have not been accessioned or deposited within a collection, either that of the university or that of the city. And so when we were presented with a series of images showing a lesser known aspect of colonial history, Sierra Leone during the Second World War, we wanted to really work with our communities in Hull to work to identify which images they were interested in. One of the things we were very important about, or stressed from the beginning, is it's not our exhibition or whatever format the amplification would take. It's the communities, it's for people of West African descent to choose. And so what we did, we began to ask them, here's some images, what would you like to do with them? And so the immediate response was, you're actually serious, you want us to decide? And that was a big shock for me, that many people have never been asked truly, what would you like to do? We spoke with people who were not necessarily highly educated or highly qualified too. We often work with people from minorities who have got really great educational attainment or political achievement. And so we wanted to work with people whose voices aren't heard of. And we also wanted them to identify what themes they felt should resonate for audiences here in the UK, but as it turned out, also in Sierra Leone too. So the actual images would go to the country where they were taken. The one thing we didn't want to do was really promote the fact a white person had taken these images, although the community said, no, that's important. You can't ignore those. They're the creators. Their voice is important too. And so one of the things we did was to work with them over a series of meetings to decide and identify which aspect of this archive of a collection of images they wanted to choose, which ones they wanted to tease out, and why that mattered to them. And that was really important for us. We did this work not just in an archive, we did it in our institute, we did it in the museums, we did it in the community's organisational headquarters too. And we all travelled to Leeds to discover further how is an independent place also tease out some of these stories too. So the one thing we wanted to do was remove all privilege all hierarchy in our approach to this story, and then hopefully tell the story of what these images had to say. The fantastic thing for us is the story is continuing to evolve, and the community is beginning to gain a greater confidence, having been involved with this project as well. So the really exciting thing for us has been the response to this project, especially when the video of this has come online. Some of the things that came out, I think that were really interesting, were really, don't be ashamed of some of the aspects of imperial history that Britain's had. Most of these people were saying, don't think everything was negative that the British did abroad. We want that told. There was also aspects that could be told and brought alive through non-archival collections too. So artwork, fabrics and other things too. So what we did, we worked in this Arts Council England funded project to connect different people, different partners in new ways. What we didn't do at any stage was be prescriptive. And we got some very bizarre responses, but actually that bizarrity made it exciting and fun to work with. And so for me as a historian, it was all about removing every single barrier to access that there was, and to work out how, using this vast collection of material, we could showcase certain things. The greatest challenge, we couldn't tell everybody's voice. We couldn't show every image. And certainly when they go to Sierra Leone, there are not as many images there as they maybe want. But that's just part of the project that we all face, how to tell this story in a very finite way, but in the most inclusive way we could do. And we're really proud of working with these different partners. And it's developed also the process has developed a strong partnership, so that actually now we're going forward, we're doing new things, not just this exhibition, new ways of working. So actually it's changed our entire strategy in Hull about how we work with people in what remains quite a monocultural area. And so how these new people, new residents of Hull, can have their voice displayed when the archive collections are maybe not as strong as they could be in other areas, when the museum's collections don't necessarily tell that story. And so through working together, we're hopefully finding new ways of telling new history to people who live in our area.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Nick. I think that gives us that lovely sense of what can happen when community ownership is the key, and when we understand different forms of expertise, and ask people what really matters to them. So from Hull, we're going to cross over to Holly Brewer, Professor of American Cultural and Intellectual History at the University of Maryland in the US. And it's an early start for Holly, so we're particularly grateful for being with us. And Holly's going to talk to us about the project Slavery, Law and Power. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks so much, Claire. Yeah, I have had coffee, but it's I have excuses if I'm goofy. Okay, so the Slavery, Law and Power project seeks to make available key manuscripts related to slavery, law, and power via collaborations between historians and archivists, giving everyone credit who's involved. And it begins with the premise that, or the observation, that slavery emerged not only separately in colonies, which is how it's usually attempted to be, how we usually attempt to understand it, but across England's empire, in a period during which power was fiercely debated. And that includes debates over what we might call democracy versus authoritarianism, rights of the people versus the dividing rights of kings, fierce debates over religion and over race. And manuscripts are so important to these debates and to the history of this period and to understanding the power structures in this period. But they're often difficult to find and to access, in especially beyond sort of one individual. And so, and especially in this world that we now live in, where there's so much disinformation and misinformation. And even historians, when you cite a manuscript that's, you know, in 17th century handwriting in somewhere that's possibly far away, how do we make it more available so people can look at it themselves and think about what's there and think about what's going on? So, and it's been especially a problem for these particular documents that connect empire and questions of power and slavery, because to some extent there's national boundaries. So because America stopped being part of the British Empire at the time of the Revolution, and because American historians mostly look at documents in American archives, to some extent, these manuscripts have been particularly underused. And it's also a problem because of censorship during this period. So a lot of what's published was officially approved, and the manuscript materials are even more important for understanding what was really going on. And so what we're trying to do is to create a kind of database of key documents with transcriptions that can help in many cases, especially with archivists' help and credit for them too, to create gateways into materials we haven't been using. There are whole collections that are part of these conversations that historians haven't been using at all. So it's about uncovering these connections.
Thank you so much, Holly. That sense of just really foregrounding access, making, both kind of ensuring, I really loved your phrase about, making sure that everybody involved is credited, but then making sure that everybody who needs to can actually access the material in a usable way. Really lovely to hear about that. So moving from that project to our final project, we're going to be hearing about a story of the Great War, Will Bradshaw's journal, from Helen Newell, who is Professor of Theatre Praxis at Edge Hill University. I also want to quickly mention that Helen's colleague, Alison Brown, is also going to be involved in the roundtable later on. But for now, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Excuse me. So this project came about because, to cut a very long story short, there's a winding history to this. I began to animate photographs, orphan photographs that I found on the web. And these were photographs of World War I soldiers who had no name. They were being sold as valuable commodities online, being horse traded, if you like. I bought some of these while I was busy looking for other photographs for a completely different project. But I bought these, I didn't know what to do with them, and ended up making a miniature installation. So it's for a one-to-one audience. You sit in it and you watch it with headphones on, and you have an interaction. And the idea of this was bringing valuable objects back from the brink of just being valuable objects to actually being subjects again, because these people had no names. They had names, but they no longer have names. There's no way of actually finding out who they are. They're the orphans of the archives, because nobody really wants them, because there are lots of these washing around eBay, but because they have no backstory, they're not necessarily historically important. So I made a thing called Remember Me, which I think Alison saw, and then we had deposited with us the journal and an album of photographs written by William Bradshaw in 1919, when he came back from World War I. And Alison, having seen Remember Me, thought that this might be something I could work with. And it was very fresh. In fact, actually, it was not actually in the archive when I got it, so I got to take it home for a night and actually read it. And there's that beautiful aura of holding a document that belongs to history, rather than just seeing PDF reproductions of it. And I've also held the diary that one of the diaries that records the World War I truce. So I've done a lot of work with World War I, but that sense of aura and the importance of these photographs as social documents has always appealed to me. So I made a piece which consists of short excerpts from the journal. The journal is actually quite large, so we didn't have the resources. Three of us worked on it. We didn't have the resources to make a huge film. So it's a much more of an impressionistic thing. And I kind of had this ethics about not introducing too many other visuals. So what we've ended up with is what I describe as a radio play with visuals. So excerpts from the diary that track through significant points in it, and it's a beautiful and strong diary to read. So looking for what I call the ghosts in the archive, bringing them back to life, just giving an essence of what you might find. So it's hopefully acting as a gateway for people that wouldn't necessarily seek out that document to actually then go and access the journal. It's highlighting the archive as a resource for everybody. I think it's also highlighting the archive as a resource not just for historians, but actually for artists as well. That there are other purposes for which archives are extremely fantastic. So. And we did have, as part of this project that Alison invited me into, was inviting people to make responses to the archive, which included writing poems, making artwork, so that it's not just, we want to smash that perception that the archive is just a list of shelved documents that just historians pore over, that there's much more that can be done. And I think I'm just working with some other photographs in the archive at the moment and just noticing things like when I'm up close and personal with them in Photoshop, the fingerprints that you see. So I can see the photographer's fingerprints in the emulsion. So that it's the archive as something that can bring you an emotional response as much as a, oh, here's a fact, or here's something else I can find out, or this is somebody's first-hand witness account of something. There's something that happens to people when they look at archives now that I'm quite interested in. So I think that's where I'll put the full stop. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen.
I'm sorry my camera is wobbling, sorry. But
that's all right, it's exciting. Thank you so much for bringing that kind of both the emotional dimension, but also encouraging us to think about aura and thinking about materiality of things and our encounter with them. And also another dimension to the whole question of who should have access to this material and the kind of creative practice dimension. I would now like to thank all to ask all of our panelists if they could all put their cameras on. Thank you. And I would like to remind everybody that we're open to all sorts of questions. So please do keep your questions coming via the Q&A function. But while you're doing that, I wanted to pose some broad questions, in some ways taking us through the life of a project, really, to reflect on the specifics of your experience, but also the kind of way in which we can pull out general advice from them. We're going to do this in a very kind of relaxed way, so just dive in. Panelists, if you have a response. I realise that you can't quite dive in because you have to unmute first, but no doubt one of us will forget to unmute. So my first question is really about the beginning. You know, you've all talked about collaborations, but actually collaborating, how do you start those collaborations? And what advice, crucially, would you give to people who are thinking, yes, you know, collaboration is where I need to be? Does somebody want to start with some thoughts on that? Nick?
Yeah, I think the biggest learning curve we had was try to avoid the gatekeepers. One of the challenges is that you go to the gatekeepers, whether they're the archival ones, the academic ones, or the community ones, and try and establish a connection with those people. Our gatekeeper let us down. I won't say who that was, but through that we had a more fruitful and dynamic relationship because the individuals involved then felt they had a greater influence. And so I think I'd suggest to people try and avoid that, try and have a direct relationship with people, and then it will hopefully create a more fruitful and dynamic conversation, because it may be reflecting new approaches to the archive or to history that you've not thought about before.
Thank you, Nick. Helen?
Hi, I'd agree with that, having just had some funding turned down, so definitely. But I think also, I mean, we did the Bradshaw thing extremely small scale, so I think we got awarded a modest amount from an internal fund at the university, and we didn't actually even use all that. That just actually paid the sound artist, Dr. Karen Lauker. And the work that I did and the work that James McPherson, the actor, did, because we both work at Edge Hill, we gave in kind, which Edge Hill might not be happy about, but nevertheless, we fitted it in. But I think starting small, but also networking. So I'm going to network. If anyone's got photographs out there and they want to contact me, and you've got photographs that you want me to mess around with as an artist, then just get in touch. So I think it's it's having your antennae open to opportunities, but making people aware that I'm open to that approach, you know, and actually being not afraid to approach other people as well and saying, are you interested in doing this? And sometimes the answer is no, but sometimes the answer is yes.
Thanks, Helen. Sarah?
I was going to say, also look at the people you're already working with, and whether that's researchers or people, you know, that you're working with on other projects or doing, you know, because we're talking about more sort of outreach collaborative projects here, but you could be working with people on any sorts of levels. So just have a chat to them and try and build, I think it's a network thing again, as Helen was saying. If you already have a relationship with somebody, it's much easier to then sort of go, tell you what, we could do this really complicated project together, because you've already worked with them and you know the ins and outs of, you know, whether that's likely to be a success.
Thanks, Sarah. I wonder if I could bring in Alison here, because Alison is here in part because of your role in sort of towards the end of the last conference, and I know that one of your responsibilities is around connecting historians and archivists. So I wondered if you had something to add, and then I'll go to Andrew.
I mean, I suppose we took an opportunity in that it's only 3 years ago that Edgell actually appointed a permanent archivist. We'd had occasional visits of short-term projects, whatever, but nothing sustained and permanent. And then Dan Copley, who unfortunately can't be with us today, was appointed as our permanent archivist, and he's made a huge difference. You know, our history team had made, you know, several forays into the archive, but basically, you know, if you're shown a room with lots of boxes in it, nothing's catalogued, nothing is, then it becomes very difficult within, you know, existing workloads. But Dan arriving, obviously lockdown affected things, but almost immediately several people from across the university made approaches to him about work they wanted to do. And of course, what then happened with the research catalyst, our library is called the Catalyst, so that's why we call this research group Research Catalyst, is that you're able to feed in to people that you know and feed on, it sounds quite predatory that, but genuine enthusiasm. So as soon as we got, you know, the first meeting, it was basically a meeting of, this is our basic purpose, we have this archive, we've got a permanent archivist, look at the opportunities we've got, and we've got a lot of people, just not all of them have stayed with us, but we've got a lot of people just coming along and saying, I think this is great, and these are my ideas. And obviously we took some time to formulate them into specific projects, but we've now got a research group, you know, relatively short time later, an ongoing, quite lively research group with multiple projects as part of it.
That's really, really helpful and really, really pleasing to hear. And I think the speed at which you've developed that Catalyst group is really, really impressive. I'll see Andrew and Holly both, I think, have something to say about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just feeds on kind of what Sarah said, but then what Alison said as well. And, you know, in terms of starting out with trying to get a kind of collaboration going, my first thing was to look for any opportunity that I could collaborate with, anyone that had kind of access to kind of, you know, to ask for a meeting in that sense. You know, you had a first kind of foot in the door type thing. And my kind of, I don't know, tactic was always to kind of present myself as like extra resource, to try and bring like a lot of enthusiasm and try and help make things happen and see what was possible. So like one of the first times we organised the Paper Trails conference, I had zero funding, zero anything, but I could book rooms for free because I was a teaching fellow. So the only thing I had was a free venue, and then everything else had to come out of that. So I ended up charging something like £3 in terms of an attendance fee. Went to the big Tesco and made, you know, stacks and stacks of sandwiches up till 3 AM making sandwiches for a conference. I just catered the whole thing myself. So for me, it was all sort of, you know, bringing by style stuff that you just keep kind of working alongside and all the rest. So I think, you know, from there, you then start to get more kind of concrete support and more kind of abilities of access to funding and all the rest of it. But it is, I think, possible to sometimes start these things, start something rolling with almost zero funding, except just like hundreds of effort in that sense. But yeah, that would be my thing.
I love that DIY approach, although you'll have to be careful that your internal caterers don't get to hear about your sandwich making. Holly.
Yeah, I wanted to say that for me, and this project, it's been especially difficult because we're trying to bring collaborators from different archives and also from different nations. And many funding packages are just nation centric. So I've had to, I mean, obviously I knew some archivists, or one in particular at the National Archives, Amanda Bevan, who I'd met at a conference, and I was able to use that connection and other things to sort of start developing a broader conversation there. And it's likewise been similar at other archives. So it's a process. It's very deliberate. It's a little bit scary reaching out to create these connections. But a lot of people have been interested, and also it matters that I don't just say, I want to use your expertise. It's how can we share our expertise, right? So that you begin with a collaborative position.
That sense of sharing is lovely. Michelle, do you want to come in?
Yes, I'd just like to say that get your librarian involved is a good a good idea. And the reason I say that is our Director of Learning and Teaching in our faculty recently said this to a group of academics, because quite often the academics are working in their disciplines in their little silos, and they're not aware of the other projects that are going on around the institution. Yet the librarian is often sitting in every meeting, who may not have so much to contribute at that moment, but is listening to everything and can see all those connections and drawing people up. And I think that's sort of how it was for me. You know, I had all these brilliant ideas about our special collections and archives. I was writing blog posts and sending out tweets, and it wasn't doing anything. But as you know, I saw an opportunity in faculty meeting and sort of made those connections, and was able to get in on the project that way, and then end up being co-project lead. So
thanks, Michelle. Certainly I'm learning a lot and thinking about possibilities through hearing you talk. So we've got the project up and running. You know, what are the requirements, the key requirements of making that project have, you know, putting a productive relationship right at the heart of it? And how do we deal with issues of size and scale? I mean, you know, we all start a project wanting to have multiple partners and for things to be really, but you can't always do that. So how have you all dealt with that in terms of the sort of the mechanics of getting it working? Sarah?
I was going to say, I don't think, and this is coming back to what I think everyone has said, is you don't have to do a big project. In fact, some of the most focused and interesting projects start really small with no money, because almost there's no expectation on you, and you can do some really amazing no-cost things in terms of comms and social media and things like that. You can do a lot of things with not very much money if you've got quite a bit of enthusiasm going. So the kind of key thing is that you are working with people who have the same aims as you do, and that you're both getting something out of it. I think those would be the key things. But you don't have to have, I mean, I think as long as you're working within a structure where you've, the one thing I would say is I would always have a wider strategy. So we've got ours is basically like, we want more people to engage with our collections and to know more about them than they did before. That's ours. And as long as everything you're doing fits with that, and you know who your audiences are, I don't think scale is your thing to worry about, to be honest.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. Any other thoughts on the kind of the expectations from partners, the how we get things running? Helen, the scale issue.
I came into this project as an artist, so I didn't have any expectation as to where we were going to end up, and I think that's quite liberating, that you know that it's not necessarily going to end up with this fixed vision, because then it's very hard sometimes to steer something towards it. So I started out, the first project I did was just me, and at the very end stage I brought in a sound artist, and then it kind of in this one it snowballed into us realizing, well, we need the voice as well. So I think we're now at the stage of if we want to collaborate, so we have that beautiful little team, and we are looking at how we then do some more of the diary that we haven't done. So I've just hopefully got some funding incoming for that, again, just to pay the sound artist. But I think at the moment, I don't need it or want it to grow any bigger, because as soon as somebody comes in from another institution, that vision that we've now built up of the previous thing gets diluted, or it maybe gets taken in a different direction. So I'm quite happy to keep this one small. It's having quite a lot of impact, but without needing to be any bigger. So I think maybe because the vision is already in place, so whatever comes now, whatever comes next has to fit with what's gone before. So I think at the outset, however, when we didn't know what we were going to do, where it could have been anything, you know, that would have been easier. But what we all have so there's still those elements of collaboration is absolute and complete honesty with one another. So if we don't like where something's heading, you know, the sound artist will tell me that's not working. I'll say to her, that's a bit rubbish. And, you know, we also have that really strong relationship, and therefore a shorthand. I don't know how you get to that other than just being really open with yourself as well. But so, you know, those relationships that you have with people that you know can be extremely valuable.
Thank you, Helen. That's Nick.
Yeah, I think echoing what everybody said, really. I think size doesn't always matter. I think a discrete committed group's just as important. One of the things we purposefully did at Hull was for the curators and the historians to be missing at times. So actually the group, if they did want to change direction, they didn't agree with us, then they could change things as well. And that was really important for us to actually make sure we had the authority to speak for these partnerships, and also to see, well, actually, if we're not there, what will happen? Will the group continue? And I think if it was an enormous group, it would quite quickly have erupted into anarchy or dissipated. But actually, the small group mattered as well. And I also think it's not a school event. You know, we don't have to have 100% attendance every time. Some people can't always attend. One of the things we did note was that actually not always everyone can afford to attend, i.e. they've got work or other things too. So we were working with a group who are not necessarily economically powerful, and therefore we had to work out, there was sometimes maybe on an evening or a weekend or really non-scheduled times when they wanted to meet in different sizes as well. So the smallness of the groups actually make them more agile and more fluid, and that actually can be productive for the group too. So even on holiday, I was getting messages saying, "We've met, here's our feelings, we'll send them through to you." And so it was really useful that they were meeting when they wanted rather than when we dictated to. So I think it's really important to make sure your group shape the agenda of when they meet, how they meet, and what that form will be.
Thank you, Nick. I mean, certainly what's coming across really clearly is that, you know, good practice is in a large part about good relationships and building trust and honesty right into projects, and creating space for that to develop as you go along. And the size thing is, you know, be as small as you like, as long as there's the overall strategy or a sense of where you want to be and where it's going. Michelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's really important as well to have that sort of holistic overview of your institution and its aims and strategies. We had our 4th Kent Maps Online symposium yesterday, where we went from originally 4 attendees to we had 40 yesterday, and a lovely attendee came. She had mapped out all the historic cinemas in Kent. She gave a talk about it, and at the end of the day she said, you know, I think I'd like to do a PhD. And so we had to have that generosity to go, you know what, go and talk to our film department, because we think you're an absolute shoo-in for them, knowing that we might not see her again for another 3 years. And you know, but you know, it's like that's going to benefit our institution, her project, and it might become a separate project, but we know that we might get one article for Kent Maps Online about that historic cinema, and hopefully we've enhanced other research in the institution as well.
I think that sense of the need for generosity sort of underpins those relationships, doesn't it? And that sense also that sometimes it might not be about us, in any way whatsoever, but it might be about a whole different thing. Serendipity means that things can go in different directions. I'm aware that we want to include some questions, and at this stage I think we might go to see if there's some questions from the Q&A, and then I might come back to you with a few kind of rounding out questions towards the end, if that's okay. So I now want to ask Philip Carter, who's the academic director of the RHS, who has kindly volunteered, who's been instrumental in organising this, along with colleagues at the IHR and the TNA. But Philip's going to voice some of the questions that we've had from you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And some very interesting questions coming in from different perspectives. I'll start with one that I think the theme of community and working with communities. So we've got archivists, we've got historians, and then we've got communities, is one that's come out in some of the discussion. And we've got a comment from John Wilson that I think leads into a question about working with communities. And John says, and it's really a piece of advice, which is, can I suggest for generating financial support for future projects? Alex Green from the Business Archives Council has succeeded in persuading firms that archives can be used to assist them in developing either identity issues or strategic decision-making. It's a bit of a selling job, but major firms such as Unilever and Barclays have been responsive. And in a way, that's very good advice. And it also raises the question of working with different forms of community groups. We often think of the community as a particular entity. I suppose, therefore, question for the panelists is experience, good or bad, of working with commercial organizations, whether there are particular ways of approaching that kind of group when you are trying to broaden out your work, and particularly to gain support that allows the project to continue.
Thanks, Philip. Anybody want to take that? Andrew?
I guess the first thing is to say, just in terms of John's question, is that, yeah, I think Alex has done some phenomenal work on that as well. Formerly this parish, obviously, as well. I job shared with Alex as Director of Comms at the RHS, and my emulation of her success was trying to convince UCL Special Collections to do this kind of stuff with paper trails. But I guess where my interest would be not necessarily commercial firms, but looking at kind of big third sector ones. And so particularly trying to do some work a lot with like the French embassy in particular, and trying to kind of work with them. It's often about trying to recognize that they have not competing desires, but competing kind of hurdles effectively. They need to justify things in different ways. I think it's important to recognize, not to be allergic to other people's forms or, the way they need to present material, but to be open and say, actually, if they have a language, a lingo which they need to communicate in, then it's often useful that we kind of moderate our own language, that we don't ever talk down to people, but we try and make sure that we're addressing the interests of all kind of stakeholders in a project. I think that holds for any kind of large organization, like an embassy as part of a government and all the rest of it, a cultural attaché, yada, yada. But also when you're approaching a business archive, obviously you can't just say, it's for the greater good, it's great for everyone and all the rest of it. We pitch things in ways that make sense in terms of what, their central objectives are. So it's, importance of understanding strategies for commercial organizations, and if it's a charity, particularly the charitable objectives as well. And voicing how your work and how your efforts can help support those things. So again, back to kind of what I said at the start, presenting yourself as extra resource and trying to develop relationships by being adaptable and kind of flexing with those things as well, I think.
Thanks, Andrew. That's incredibly helpful. Sarah?
I want to say this is a slightly side thing, but it sort of highlights the importance of evaluation and reflection on these projects as well. It's really easy to do a project and then go, brilliant, done it, spent the money, and then whatever's happening next. But we've tried really hard, and this is why we've put a stream into Paper Trails that is around engagement and co-creation, and so that practitioners can do some kind of reflection on it, because only by looking at that can you sort of go, okay, well, this worked, this didn't work, this was a great pilot, we might want to go here, 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 here. And then when you're approaching people afterwards to try and expand your project or get a new partnership or a new audience or whatever, you can sort of go, look, there's this thing that we did. We know this bit is brilliant for what you might want to do. And this, so just trying to, I think it's all about doing that kind of reflective, which bits would be great for what afterwards, once you've done the work. It's so difficult to fit that in. in terms of timescales and workloads and things like that. But I think it's fairly key if you want to continue to build your projects into something sustained, ongoing, actually funded, which is nice.
I mean, that thing about it being work, that this work stuff doesn't happen by accident. It involves work, and we put work into it. I'm going to ask Philip to give us another question, if that's all right, Philip.
Thanks, Claire. A very interesting question from Leslie, who is beginning to undertake research for a PhD. And I think the question Leslie's posing applies to broader projects, which is, as a historian coming to an archive and to archivists, what should the historian expect from an archivist? How much should they be able to guide a project? And what is the best way to approach and begin to build that relationship? And I suppose the same question could apply for the historians working in turn with the archivists. But Leslie's coming to it from the perspective of an archivist wanting to get the most out of the archive she'll be using, but also the best way in which she can form collaborative relationships with individual archivists.
Ooh, who would like to take that one? Sarah.
I have just spoken, but I am an archivist by training. I think come in at the beginning. That's so one of the things that can happen, and I'm not saying this is that people come in with a fully formed thing and then go, and what can you do with my thing? I think if you come in going, I'm interested in this, but I'm not quite, what have you got? And you can have that as a conversation, as opposed to I've just got funding for this. I'd like you to now do all the work to find the resource for, I think it's probably about really focusing on that collaborative, because you'll get something much better if you come in with that, because, the archivists do know what's in their collections. They know who's used them. They know which bits aren't used, actually, and which bits have just been catalogued, or which bits nobody's looked at before. So I would go in with that sort of approach initially. I can't remember what the rest of the question was, but yeah.
Holly, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to a really interesting article. I don't have the reference to hand, but I can share it later. Done to a study done by the National Archives themselves about how historians keep going back to the same limited set of records over and over again, and they don't even know about the existence of others. And one of the approaches I've taken in the collaboration I'm doing or starting right now with the National Archives, I mean, it's been months and we're still trying to put together grant proposals, but is asking them from their perspectives of their collections, what they see in those collections. And it's quite extraordinary in terms of what's there that nobody's looked at. And some of it's from records that are only now being cataloged, which is extraordinary in and of itself when you think about the National Archives. But some of it's from records that have long been cataloged, but people just haven't thought to look at them. And the richness is mind-boggling almost, and it just speaks to the importance of yes, I would echo what Sarah said, of asking open-ended questions when you think about archivists as partners.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you. Shall we get another of the questions in there, Philip?
Yeah, there's several questions that have come in relating to working with digital resources and digital tools. And I think all of the projects that we've highlighted today have a digital element. And Lucy O'Sullivan has asked that she'd be really interested to hear if the panelists have any advice about managing the digital dimension of their projects. Did it take a lot of time or resource to create and maintain a project or a website? And she's particularly interested in collaborating with a regional archive in Mexico. So much of my engagement will be the archivist communities will need to be online. And a separate question that came in, which is, again, similarly related to how practitioners found working with new technologies and methods such as video or digital tools. And this question is particularly interested in the accessibility and the use for wider communities who are involved in the project. You can have specialists within the project team, but making that transfer to people who may not be quite so adept in that world of digital humanities is one that questioner would like to have. So 2 approaches there to digital technology in your project.
Great questions. Thanks, Philip. Who would like to kick us off? Michelle?
So yeah, I think it's such an important question because it's such a thorny one as well. I tried to campaign that we would buy into an archive project like Adam Matthews or JSTOR Community Collections, because I thought this was the best way to sort of to host our images. But you know, there wasn't the buy-in institutionally. They didn't see that, you know, our small collection of images was going to be worth the investment into those platforms. So we use GitHub, which obviously is free software, but GitHub is not really designed for hosting lots of images. It's designed for developing the software, and we have our essays there, but the images have to be hosted elsewhere. So we have been using very generously, JSTOR have supported us. We've been using their site to host some of our images, but we do use a lot of Wikimedia Commons images. And you know, I see increasingly sites like the Internet Archive and who else have I seen? I can't think, but there are other sites that are hosting images now. I mean, it makes it, you know, it's almost like a slightly confusing mishmash for anyone trying to find archival sources, that they're in so many different places. But I think it's the reality of finding that hosting space. So I don't know if I've answered the question or just raised more, but.
Thanks, Michelle. Holly.
Yeah, this is an issue we have struggled with from the beginning, and we've been going for about 5 years now in terms of at least the planning portion. And we experimented with a lot of things. And what we've ended up with is separate from my university, publishing just a regular website, and then using WordPress and using a particular platforms within WordPress, which can be pretty flexible in coordination sometimes with other programs like Amica. And yes, we have had to pay for them. And also for transcription, we've been using a platform called From the Page, which is run by a husband-wife team. They're quite extraordinary, among other things that it would allow for. If we get to that point, group transcription of particular documents or collaborative transcription, open access. And what we've also been really aware of too is longevity. So websites you can purchase for 10 years at a time, and obviously you try to build in a plan to make sure it gets purchased again. But more importantly, we've been working with other archives and repositories to think about how these documents, which we've transcribed, which we have images of, which we have introductions for, can be put in permanent places and duplicated in different places so that they'll always be findable once this research is done. And there's a variety of long-term repositories. One in the United States, which I think is actually available elsewhere, is called Open Science Foundation, and it's got the word science in it, which sounds intimidating, but it's actually a place where you can literally just store, and they guarantee for 50 years. And I think they've got support from the US government of permanent storage for documents. So anyway, it's constantly evolving, but there's a variety of solutions we've kept experimenting with to increase access and to make things available.
Alison, was that your hand?
Hi, yeah, it's really just to kind of support some of what's just been said. I mean, I think dangerous is sometimes leap in, especially if you are quite good technically and kind of embark on things that are quite ambitious and complicated. But actually, especially at the beginning, and our project is still relatively new, you know, our research group and its projects are still relatively new. You can do a lot with a basic WordPress site within a relatively short space of time. There's lots of flexible things you can do with that. You can blog, you can use all the images. You know, I mean, we're lucky we've got a lot of images that we actually own, so we make the most of those, get those out. Short pieces, blogs. It's a good way of keeping a record of what you're doing because you can have an events kind of part to it. Just do short pieces about that are meant for a public audience, but also work well internally, and again, taking photos of the things that you're doing. So I think as a starting point, WordPress is a great flexible platform. You can do a huge amount with it. We've got Helen's project, the videos accessible on that. We've got spreadsheets. We've got lots of different kinds of things connected to it. And then to take a bit of time thinking about where you're going, you know, what's your main purposes, what are the strengths, and then investigate. And then investigating how and where you want to go with those. At the moment, we're in discussions with our computing department. There's a lot of expertise there, taking advice, setting up a prototype database for open access. So that would be, you know, we're still at a relatively early stage. Mostly what we've got is that WordPress site, but as a beginning for our first year, it worked great.
Thanks, Alison. I mean, these responses also raise questions around legacy and, you know, whether it matters if things are time limited or whether we always have to be thinking of a long-term legacy, Michelle.
Yeah, this is really pertinent for us. When I came to HAP in London a few weeks ago, I was on a cloud with our project, and then after that day I discovered that one of our team is retiring in a year's time, and this is our IT expert. So you know, we then had that we're putting in a year's plan till his retirement to get the legacy sorted out, to make sure that we've got someone else who can support our infrastructure going forward. He's suggesting that we move to a WordPress site, ironically, having sort of not been on WordPress. I mean, institutionally we have WordPress, but we're sort of slightly anxious about this because WordPress is something that's managed by our media and comms team. They have a set way of controlling the WordPress, you know, with university colours and logos, and you know, we don't want to lose what we've already created. So it will be interesting to see how we move over the next year to keep our project going. But I think there's also that issue with projects is you know, in universities we're very sort of stuck in this sort of like ref cycle, and so you know, we create this project, you know, it goes through the ref cycle, and then a new ref cycle starts, and everybody else has to think about, you know, I've got to innovate again, I've got to have a new ref project, you know, I've got to prove I'm researching. And I think if we're working with communities as we are, we really need to respect the input of our communities and our volunteers, and make sure that these stories are preserved beyond the life cycle of a ref. And so we do have a huge responsibility when we establish these projects. And I think, you know, that is something that we're really keen to embed in our project, is that long-term future for the project.
Thank you, Michelle. Andrew, I think did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that Michelle raises. Sometimes we think about the idea of, you know, parking something with a big institution like a university or something will kind of guarantee longevity. And one of the difficulties you often find is actually the structures of an organization. They can change and move around, and very quickly something that seems kind of immutable and digital in a kind of like, you know, a big university is suddenly sidelined because of a change of platform, a change of structure, and a team that you've got absolutely no links to and all the rest of it. So I think it is really important to actually put those kind of plans in place right at the start, to think about how you can work with people, how you can actually kind of guarantee some things as well in terms of kind of longevity of service and all these kind of things, and to keep it kind of alert to it on a kind of risk register as well. But yeah, I think also worth pointing out, I think Philip's just added something as well to the chat as well, to that end. But yeah, I'll pass over.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm aware of time, and although it feels like we've only just started, we are actually coming up towards the end, which I personally think is really sad, which we could go on for a much longer time. But I did want to kind of go back to you all before a roundup, and just ask you really if you could just succinctly, if we go around, you could all offer just one piece of advice from your project to everybody else who's on the call today about how to do this work well. So maybe if I could start by asking Helen, actually, you know, one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think to do the work that I do well, I think keep an open mind. I think, as I said before, I didn't have to have a set image of where I was going to end up. So I worked kind of heuristically by trial and error, by going, oh, this works, or that looks good, or that didn't work, right, reverse, try again. So just keeping an open mind, scanning for opportunities. And I think my second piece of advice as an artist who's not in an archive is to befriend the archivist. So, you know, I buy Dan coffees and bribe him and follow him around like a puppy, because as somebody else has mentioned, they are such valuable resources. They know what they've got, and so they make my job an awful lot easier. You know, those things in the archive that nobody's looked at, that I think Michelle was talking about, that you know, the orphans out there that nobody else looks at, they need voices, so look for those.
Thank you, Helen. That's really great. And the archivists amongst us are probably all thinking, hey, yes, yes, indeed. Quick piece of advice from everybody else. I'm going to go around. Sarah.
Work with good people. Find people that are on your wavelength, and also recognise the way other people work and that everyone's busy. I think sort of going in with a demand to do stuff is never works. And also archivists do love enthusiasm, Helen. Absolutely love it. If you come in and you love their collections, you'll go into the top 5 of favourite people that they'll do things for.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Alison, quick piece of advice.
Okay, what would I say? I do think from an early point, having an eye on who's going to support you. Obviously, you've got your collaborators, you may have those, that enthusiasm, that honesty, that transparency, but where are you going to get your support from? Because I think, obviously, there's that eye on the prize for external funding, but we need some support internally as well. So obviously, we had a relatively easy task. It was about our university archive that had barely been used before. So we had a pretty good idea that the university was going to be interested. So it did help to get that positiveness and a little bit of internal funding.
Thank you. Yes, internal funding. Thank you. Right, the rest of you, I'm going to have to ask you literally for one sentence each. So, Andrew, can you give us a sentence?
I think roll the punches and keep trying, even if you get a disappointment. That's my advice.
That's brilliant advice. Nick?
Partnerships. Yeah, work with different types of organisation.
Thank you. Holly?
Respecting the people you work with, that there are so many who have so much to contribute, and making sure that everyone gets credit.
Thank you. And Michelle?
I would say that find a co-lead that you can work with, and we've ended up finishing each other's sentences. We know the project so well and our aspirations for it, and I think, you know, it is partnerships, as Nick said.
Thank you guys. We are just a couple of minutes out from finishing our session. Before we close, I do want to flag up that we'll be issuing a call for HAP 24 soon. I also want to flag up History Day North, which you'll see more details about in the closing slide. And I want to thank everybody involved today, particularly Philip Carter at the RHS. Thank you, Philip. Gemma Dormer at the IHR, and Molly Clark at TNA. And of course, huge thanks to all our panelists today. It genuinely was a joy to hear you talking with each other and with our colleagues in the audience. Thank you, everybody, for coming. These things only work if there are people in the audience and who are kind of willing to be involved. I think on closing, I'm reflecting on the fact that there's such a lovely sense of community building around this. So let's carry on talking, creating, thinking together. and I hope to see everybody at HAP 24. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon.